John Harper lived a quiet life on his ranch, far away from the chaos of the city. Nestled just outside the urban sprawl, his property was a slice of paradise, a place where he could wake up to the sound of birds chirping and spend his days tending to his horses, fixing broken fences, or simply enjoying the peace that came with wide-open spaces. To John, it wasn't just a home. It was a sanctuary. But as anyone who's ever lived in a neighborhood governed by an HOA knows, serenity often comes with strings attached. The homeowners association in John's community had a reputation for being, let's say, overzealous. They weren't content with just making sure the grass was cut or the mailboxes matched. They wanted perfection. And leading the charge was one woman whose name had become synonymous with micromanagement, Karen Miller. She wasn't your average neighbor. No, Karen was that neighbor, the one who carried a clipboard everywhere she went, wore sunglasses indoors like she was auditioning for a spy movie, and treated every minor infraction as if it were a federal crime. Karen had been breathing down John's neck since the day he moved into the area 3 years ago. At first, her complaints seemed harmless enough. A note slipped under his door about how his mailbox was too rustic for the neighborhood aesthetic. An email reminding him that tractors shouldn't kick up too much dust because it disturbed the neighbors. Even a stern letter informing him that leaving firewood stacked near the driveway violated some obscure clause in the HOA handbook. John had rolled his eyes at these nitpicks but tried not to take them personally. After all, Karen was nothing more than background noise, like a buzzing fly you swat away when it gets too close. But lately, things had started to escalate. It wasn't just passive-aggressive notes anymore. Karen began showing up unannounced, inspecting his property with a critical eye and snapping photos like she was gathering evidence for a court case. Once, she even parked her car halfway into his driveway while lecturing him about how his barn roof needed repainting. John had politely nodded along during those encounters, biting his tongue to avoid saying something he might regret later. He figured she'd eventually tire herself out and move on to torment someone else. That illusion of calm shattered one sunny afternoon when John glanced out his kitchen window and saw something so absurd it made him do a double take. There, teetering precariously on top of his wooden fence, was Karen. Yes, the Karen. Her designer jeans caught on a splintered plank, her arms flailing wildly as she tried to maintain balance. For a moment, John thought he was hallucinating. What on earth was she doing climbing over his fence? Was this some kind of weird initiation ritual for the HOA? Or maybe she'd finally lost her mind? Curiosity got the better of him, and he grabbed his boots before heading outside to investigate. As he approached the fence, Karen finally managed to scramble down onto his side of the property. Her face was beet red, not just from physical exertion, but also, John suspected, from sheer embarrassment. Still, she quickly composed herself, smoothing out her clothes and clutching her trusty clipboard like it was a lifeline. "What are you doing here?" John asked, crossing his arms as he stopped a few feet away. His tone was calm, but there was an edge of irritation beneath the surface. This wasn't just trespassing. It was bizarre behavior, even for Karen. "I'm inspecting your fence," she announced, her voice dripping with authority. "It's leaning into the communal easement, which is a clear violation of HOA guidelines." John blinked, processing her words. Then he gestured toward the gate a few yards away. "By climbing over my fence? Don't you think knocking would have been easier?" Karen stiffened, clearly not expecting pushback. "This is official business," she retorted sharply, holding up her clipboard as if it somehow justified her actions. "Besides, your gate was locked. So instead of respecting private property, you decided to break in?" John shot back, his voice rising slightly. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Sure, Karen had always been nosy, but this was next-level ridiculousness. Who climbed someone else's fence without permission? As the conversation continued, Karen grew increasingly defensive. Her usual air of superiority cracked under the pressure of John's pointed questions. The more she talked, the more unhinged she seemed. It was becoming painfully obvious that this wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was personal. And as the tension mounted, neither of them realized they were about to cross a line that would change everything. John stood there, arms crossed, staring at the woman who had somehow managed to make her way onto his property. She was standing awkwardly on his side of the fence, brushing off dirt from her jeans while clutching that clipboard like it was some kind of shield. Her face was still red, whether from embarrassment or anger, he couldn't tell, but she wasn't backing down. "This is official business," Karen repeated, her voice firmer this time but laced with defensiveness. "Your fence is leaning into the communal easement. That's a violation of HOA rules." John let out a short laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "So you thought climbing over my fence was the best way to handle this? You couldn't knock on my door like a normal person?" Karen hesitated for a second, her eyes darting around as if searching for a comeback. When she spoke again, her tone shifted to something more accusatory. "I tried being polite before, but you never listen. Every time I bring up an issue, you ignore me. So yes, I took matters into my own hands." John raised an eyebrow. "Took matters into your own hands? By breaking into my property? That's not how any of this works." Karen squared her shoulders, trying to regain control of the situation. "It's not breaking in if I'm doing my job. Someone has to enforce the rules around here, and clearly no one else is stepping up." John sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. He could feel a headache coming on. This wasn't the first time Karen had pulled something like this, but it was definitely the most extreme. Most people would send a letter or call a meeting if they had concerns about a fence. Not Karen. No, she had to climb over it like she was starring in some low-budget action movie. "Let me get this straight," John said slowly, enunciating each word. "You climbed my fence because you think it's leaning too far? And what exactly were you planning to do once you got here? Measure it with your clipboard?" Karen bristled at the sarcasm in his voice. "Don't mock me. This is serious. If every homeowner ignored the rules, this neighborhood would fall apart." John threw his hands up in exasperation. "Okay, fine. Let's say I believe you. What gives you the right to come onto my property without permission? Did the HOA give you a badge or something? Are you the sheriff now?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, momentarily flustered. For all her bluster, she didn't have a good answer. Instead, she doubled down, pointing a finger at him. "You're always finding ways to break the rules. Your barn roof needs painting, your tractor kicks up dust, and now this fence issue. It's like you don't care about anyone but yourself." John felt his patience wearing thin. Normally, he'd walk away from a conversation like this, but something about the absurdity of the moment kept him rooted in place. Maybe it was the sight of Karen standing there, looking ridiculous as she clung to her clipboard like it held the secrets of the universe. Or maybe it was the sheer audacity of her accusations. Whatever it was, he wasn't ready to let this go just yet. "You know what?" John said, taking a step closer. "I take care of my property. I fix things when they need fixing, and I respect the rules, most of them anyway. But none of that gives you the right to barge in here like you own the place. You can't just climb fences whenever you feel like it. That's called trespassing." Karen's eyes narrowed, and her grip on the clipboard tightened. "Trespassing? Don't turn this around on me. I'm here to protect the community. If anything, you're the one causing problems." Now it was John's turn to raise his voice. "Protect the community?" By sneaking onto my land and accusing me of things that aren't even true? Give me a break." The argument escalated quickly, their voices growing louder with each passing second. John gestured emphatically, pointing out the gate Karen could have used instead of scaling the fence. Karen countered with wild hand movements, her clipboard swinging dangerously close to John's face. Neither of them noticed how animated they'd become until Karen suddenly lunged forward, waving the clipboard like a weapon. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice shrill and panicked. John stumbled backward, startled by the sudden movement. Whoa, who said anything about getting physical? Put the clipboard down, okay? We're having a conversation here." But Karen wasn't listening. Her face was flushed, her breathing rapid. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to lash out at anything that moved. And then, without warning, she let out a scream, a high-pitched, ear-splitting shriek that echoed across the open. John froze, unsure of what to do next. Neighbors began peeking out their windows, drawn by the commotion. A few heads popped up over backyard fences, curious about the source of the noise. Before John could say another word, Karen whipped out her phone and dialed 911. "He's threatening me," she yelled into the receiver, her voice trembling with emotion. "Send the police immediately." John stared at her, completely dumbfounded. Threatening her? All he'd done was ask why she was illegally on his land. Now she was twisting the entire situation, making it sound like he was some kind of monster. Anger bubbled inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He reached for his own phone and started recording the interaction. "Go ahead," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see how this plays out." Karen glanced at him, her eyes wide with indignation. "Turn that off. You can't record me." "I can do whatever I want on my own property," John shot back. "Besides, I think it's important to document what's really happening here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were Karen's heavy breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, as if realizing she'd lost the upper hand, Karen turned her attention back to the phone. "Officer, please hurry," she pleaded. "He's dangerous." John shook his head, muttering under his breath. This whole thing was spiraling out of control, and he knew it was only going to get worse once the authorities arrived. Still, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction knowing he had evidence to back up his side of the story. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Karen had bitten off more than she could chew this time. This part sets the stage for the arrival of the police and adds tension through escalating emotions and actions. Each character's perspective is highlighted to keep readers engaged and invested in the outcome. The sound of sirens broke the tension-filled air as two police cruisers rolled up John's driveway, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered along the edges of the property, whispering among themselves and craning their necks to get a better view. Some held phones aloft, recording the chaos like it was a live episode of some reality TV drama. Karen stood near the fence, her clipboard still clutched tightly in one hand, while John leaned casually against his tractor, arms crossed and phone in hand. The officers stepped out of their cars, their expressions unreadable but professional. "All right, folks," one of the officers said, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the murmurs of the onlookers. "What's going on here?" Karen didn't waste a second. She sprang forward, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to reach the officers. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with indignation, and she began speaking before they'd even fully approached her. "This man," she jabbed a finger dramatically toward John, who remained unmoved by her theatrics, "is completely out of control. He threatened me. I'm just trying to do my job as part of the HOA, and he attacked me." John sighed audibly, shaking his head. He stayed where he was, letting Karen dig herself deeper into her story without interrupting. It wasn't hard to see how ridiculous her version of events sounded, especially since half the neighborhood had probably already seen snippets of what really happened thanks to the videos circulating online. One of the officers raised an eyebrow at Karen's dramatic tone. "Ma'am, can you explain exactly what happened?" he asked, pulling out a notepad. Karen launched into her tale with all the flair of someone auditioning for a soap opera. According to her, she had been conducting routine inspections of the communal easement when John confronted her aggressively. She claimed he blocked her path, shouted threats, and even lunged at her, all because she pointed out that his fence was leaning too far onto shared property. To hear her tell it, John was some kind of unhinged lunatic who took offense at the mere mention of rules. As Karen spoke, the other officer glanced at John, who simply shrugged and held up his phone. "I recorded everything," he said calmly, pressing play on the video. The footage showed Karen climbing awkwardly over the fence, wobbling precariously before dropping onto his side of the property. It captured her accusing him of ignoring HOA guidelines, followed by their heated exchange, and yes, Karen's wild gesticulations with the clipboard made an appearance too. Most damning of all, though, was the clear evidence that John had never laid a hand on her. If anything, he'd been the picture of restraint throughout the entire ordeal. The first officer watched the video silently, his expression shifting from skepticism to amusement. When it ended, he turned back to Karen, whose face had gone pale. "So, you climbed over his fence uninvited?" he asked, his tone neutral but tinged with disbelief. I had no choice." Karen stammered, her confidence wavering. "He locks his gate, and I needed to inspect the property." "And did he threaten you?" The officer pressed. Karen hesitated, glancing nervously between the officers and the growing audience of neighbors. "Well, not exactly. But he was intimidating. You saw how he acted in that video." The second officer chimed in, his voice firm but measured. "Ma'am, trespassing is a serious matter. Even if your intentions were related to HOA duties, you don't have the authority to enter private property without permission. That's not how this works." Karen's mouth dropped open, and for a moment she looked like she might burst into tears. But I'm protecting the community," she protested weakly. "If I don't enforce the rules, who will?" The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unimpressed by her argument. One of them stepped closer to her, lowering his voice slightly so only she could hear. "Look, we understand you're passionate about keeping things in order, but there are proper channels for handling disputes like this. Breaking into someone's property isn't one of them." Meanwhile, John stood quietly off to the side, watching the spectacle unfold with a mix of satisfaction and mild pity. Part of him felt bad for Karen. She clearly believed she was doing the right thing, even if her methods were wildly inappropriate. But another part of him couldn't help but feel vindicated. For years, she'd nitpicked every aspect of his life under the guise of enforcing HOA rules, treating him like some sort of perpetual troublemaker. Now, finally, the truth was out in the open for everyone to see. The officers wrapped up their assessment. Quickly after that, they advised Karen to leave the property immediately and warned her against taking similar actions in the future. As she slunk away, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline, John couldn't resist calling out after her. "Next time, try knocking," he said dryly, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. Karen shot him a glare over her shoulder, but didn't respond. She climbed back into her car and sped off, leaving behind a trail of dust and lingering tension. The officers lingered a bit longer, asking John if he wanted to file a formal complaint about the trespassing incident. He shook his head, declining politely. "No need," he told them. "I think today's events speak for themselves." With that, The officers tipped their hats and headed back to their cruisers, leaving John alone with his thoughts and the curious stares of his neighbors. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire through the community, fueled by the videos and eyewitness accounts that painted Karen as the aggressor rather than the victim she claimed to be. By nightfall, social media was ablaze with memes and jokes about Fencegate Karen, turning her ill-fated inspection into local legend. For John, the experience served as both validation and a reminder. Validation that standing up for himself, even in the face of absurdity, was worth it. And a reminder that sometimes people take rules so seriously that they forget basic decency and respect. As he walked back toward his house, he couldn't help but smile. Life on the ranch might not always be peaceful, but it sure was interesting. The days following the infamous Fencegate incident brought a wave of attention that John hadn't anticipated. News of Karen's dramatic fence-climbing stunts spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, fueled by gossip, shared videos, and plenty of snarky commentary. It was the kind of story people couldn't resist talking about, equal parts absurd and entertaining. By Monday morning, it felt like everyone within a 5-mile radius knew what had happened. At first, John tried to ignore the buzz. He went about his usual routine, feeding the horses, repairing a leaky pipe in the barn, and fixing the very fence that had caused all the trouble. But no matter how hard he tried to stay out of the spotlight, the aftermath kept finding him. Neighbors stopped by under the guise of borrowing tools or asking for advice on their own fences, but it didn't take long for the real reason for their visits to surface. "Hey, heard about what happened with Karen?" one neighbor said, awkwardly scratching the back of his neck. "Pretty wild stuff," John chuckled, leaning against his workbench. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. Never thought I'd see someone scale my fence over a couple of inches of wood." The neighbor laughed nervously before adding, "Honestly, though, we're glad you stood your ground. Karen's been riding everyone's case for years. Maybe this'll finally get her to back off." It wasn't just the neighbors who were chiming in. Local social media groups exploded with posts about the incident. Someone had uploaded a grainy video of Karen mid-climb, captioned "When HOA duty goes too far." Another user created a meme featuring a cartoon cat clinging to a fence with the text, "Me trying to enforce rules I don't actually understand." The comments section was a mix of laughter, sympathy for John, and thinly veiled frustration with Karen's behavior. Even the local news station caught wind of the story. A reporter showed up at John's ranch on Tuesday afternoon, microphone in hand and camera crew in tow. At first, John was hesitant to talk. He didn't want to fan the flames any further, but curiosity got the better of him. Plus, he figured it might be good to set the record straight once and for all. "So, can you tell us what happened?" the reporter asked, gesturing toward the fence where the drama had unfolded. John shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "Well, I came outside and found someone climbing over my fence. Turns out it was Karen from the HOA, saying she needed to inspect it because it was leaning into the easement. Things escalated from there. And she called the police on you?" The reporter pressed, clearly intrigued. "Yep," John replied with a wry smile. "I threatened her." Which, as you can imagine, came as quite a surprise to me. The interview aired that evening, and by Wednesday morning, John's phone was blowing up with notifications. Friends and acquaintances he hadn't heard from in years were texting him messages of support or just to tease him about becoming an internet sensation. One buddy sent him a screenshot of a Reddit thread titled "Hero Rancher vs. Overzealous HOA Karen," which had thousands of upvotes and endless jokes about clipboards and boundary lines. Despite the humor surrounding the situation, not everyone was amused. Some residents sided with Karen, arguing that John should have simply cooperated with her inspection instead of making a scene. A few even suggested that his refusal to comply with HOA guidelines made him partly responsible for the fiasco. These criticisms stung a little, but John reminded himself that he couldn't please everyone. Besides, most of the feedback he received was overwhelmingly positive. As for Karen, she seemed to retreat into hiding after the incident. Her once frequent appearances around the neighborhood became rare, and when she did venture out, she avoided eye contact with anyone who dared glance her way. Rumor had it that the HOA board had given her a stern talking to about proper protocol, though no official statement was ever released. Whatever the case, her fiery determination to micromanage the community appeared to have dimmed significantly. In the weeks that followed, life on the ranch slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such a bizarre event. John installed a security camera near the fence line, partly to deter future trespassers and partly to capture anything else ridiculous that might happen. He also started locking his gate more consistently, figuring it was better to be safe than sorry. But perhaps the biggest change came in how John viewed his role in the community. Before the fence incident, he'd mostly kept to himself, preferring solitude over small talk. Now, though, he found himself engaging more with his neighbors, sharing laughs and swapping stories about past run-ins with Karen. There was a newfound camaraderie among them, a shared understanding that sometimes standing up for yourself even, if it means facing off with a clipboard-wielding HOA member, is worth it. One evening, as John sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on everything that had transpired. Sure, the whole ordeal had been stressful and strange, but it had also taught him something valuable, that people respond to authenticity. By refusing to back down and documenting the truth, he'd not only defended his property but also earned the respect of those around him. And as for Karen, well, let's just say her days of scaling fences were likely behind her. If nothing else, she'd learned that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, even in the name of enforcing rules. Months after the infamous Fencegate incident, life in the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm. The buzz around Karen's dramatic fence-climbing stunt had died down, but its effects lingered like ripples on a pond. For John, it marked the start of a subtle yet meaningful shift, not just in how he interacted with his neighbors, but also in how he viewed himself and his place in the community. At first, things felt strange. Neighbors who used to nod politely as they passed by now stopped to chat, often bringing up the incident with a mix of humor and admiration. Some even admitted they'd been too intimidated by Karen to speak up before, thanking John for setting a precedent. It wasn't uncommon for him to overhear snippets of conversations at the local coffee shop or hardware store. "Did you hear what happened with Karen?" Someone would whisper, followed by laughter or a shake of the head. Karen herself seemed to have undergone a transformation, or at least she was doing her best to stay out of the spotlight. Gone were the days when she'd march through the streets with her clipboard, pointing out every minor infraction she spotted. Instead, she kept to herself, occasionally sending emails about upcoming HOA meetings or posting reminders about landscaping guidelines online. Her tone was noticeably softer now, almost apologetic, as if she were trying to rebuild trust with the community she'd once ruled with an iron fist. Still, old habits die hard. One Saturday morning, John noticed a flyer taped to his mailbox, advertising a neighborhood beautification day. According to the flyer, volunteers were encouraged to gather at the park to clean up litter, trim hedges, and discuss ways to improve curb appeal. At the bottom, there was a note reminding everyone to adhere to HOA standards signed, predictably, by none other than Karen. John smirked as he read it, torn between amusement and mild exasperation. He debated skipping the event altogether. Who Needed another lecture about grass height? But curiosity got the better of him. Besides, part of him wanted to see how Karen would handle herself in front of the crowd. Would she still try to dominate the conversation, or had she learned her lesson? When he arrived at the park later that day, he found a surprisingly large turnout. Families were scattered across the green space, picking up trash and chatting casually while kids chased each other around the playground. Near the picnic tables, a group of volunteers worked together to plant flowers along the walking path. And standing near the center of it all, clipboard in hand, was Karen. She looked nervous, glancing around as if bracing herself for criticism. When she spotted John approaching, her face flushed slightly, and she quickly turned her attention to smoothing out the papers on her clipboard. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The awkwardness hung heavy in the air. Finally, Karen cleared her throat. Thanks for coming," she muttered, avoiding eye contact. "We could use all the help we can get." John nodded, deciding to take the high road. "No problem. Looks like a good turnout." To her credit, Karen didn't push her usual agenda during the event. She stayed mostly quiet, letting others lead discussions and make decisions. At one point, she even helped carry bags of mulch to the flower beds, though she struggled under the weight and nearly tripped over a tree root in the process. A few people chuckled, including John, but no one teased her outright. If anything, her efforts seemed genuine, a small step toward redemption. As the day wound down, John found himself sitting on a bench near the edge of the park, sipping water and watching the sun dip below the horizon. Karen hesitated for a moment before joining him, perching cautiously on the opposite end of the bench. "I guess I owe you an apology," she said quietly, staring at the ground. "What happened?" "Well, it was uncalled for. I let things get out of hand." John raised an eyebrow, surprised by her candor. "Yeah, you did. But hey, mistakes happen. Just try not to climb any more fences, okay?" Karen managed a weak smile, shaking her head. "Trust me, I've learned my lesson." "Maybe. I was too intense about everything. People don't respond well to that, you think?" John replied dryly, earning a laugh from both of them. For the first time, John saw Karen not as the self-appointed enforcer of HOA rules, but as a person who, despite her flaws, genuinely cared about the neighborhood. Sure, her methods were questionable, but her intentions, at least most of them, weren't entirely malicious. In a way, the whole ordeal had humanized her, stripping away the layers of authority and pretense to reveal someone who was, at heart, just trying to do their best. The experience left John with a deeper appreciation for the complexities of community living.
Rules mattered.
Of course, they kept things running smoothly and ensured everyone played fair, but so did kindness, patience, and understanding. Sometimes, enforcing guidelines meant more than just pointing out violations. It meant listening, compromising, and recognizing that perfection was impossible. Over time, the neighborhood began to feel different. Conversations grew warmer, disagreements less heated. Even the HOA meetings became less formal, with residents chiming in with ideas and suggestions rather than sitting silently while Karen dictated terms. Slowly but surely, the community was finding its balance, one that prioritized harmony over control. As for John, he continued to live his quiet life on the ranch, tending to his horses and enjoying the peace that came with wide-open spaces. But now, he did so with a renewed sense of connection to his neighbors, to the land, and to the shared responsibility of creating a place where everyone could thrive. And whenever he walked past the fence where it all began, he couldn't help but smile. After all, sometimes the smallest moments leave the biggest impact.